Hello and welcome to the Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition. I'm Sarah Baumann.
And I'm Kenny Crookston. And together we're here to uncover the amazing and unusual stories that define the brass band world. From its origins and traditions to the modern innovations and fantastic music that have shaped this remarkable culture.
In each episode, we'll dive into Brass Bands England's exciting brass band archive, housed at Heritage Quay at the University of Huddersfield.
So, whether you're a seasoned brass band lover,
just getting started,
or just curious, you're in the right place.
Let's go! Welcome to the final episode of this series of the Brass Band Podcast. I'm here with Kenny. Has your weekend been filled with banding?
It's been absolutely action-packed with banding. I had a fantastic weekend. Saturday was the 170th British Open Brass Band Championships in Birmingham. I haven't been at them all. I've been at a lot of them, but not 170. But it was fantastic. Yeah, it was a really great day. Lovely test piece. 18 really good performances. Some absolutely gobsmackingly good performances. And the winning one was just out of this world. So a really good day on Saturday. And on Sunday, I went down to Portland, which is like that wee bit that sticks out the bottom of England, in Dorset, for the Elevate performance by Weymouth Concert Brass and the Rebecca Deniff piece that was written for them about the herbs and the various wildlife that's found around that part of the world. And it was great. The band did a really brilliant job on the piece. You can see they put an awful lot of work into it. And it was a lovely part of the world to be in as well. I thought I was in Scotland, though the weather was just a bit kind of Scottish. I expected it to be better.
A nice large range of banding, though. Symphony Hall, British Open, to a community band playing in a churchyard.
Absolutely. I mean, a very kind of modest community band doing what they do best. You know, they were entertaining the people in the local area. A few tourists had drifted in as well, I think. It was a fantastic thing to witness, just to see players who are not Tres Etoile and Black Dyke and these other great bands that we had on Saturday. A long way away from them in terms of scope and ambition and talent. But so much of what we witnessed was exactly the same. Amateur musicians doing their very best and actually making something sound really, really good. So music on a different scale, a band on a different scale, but you know, in many ways it was just as enjoyable. So great effort from Weymouth Concert Brass, and just in terms of, you know, to see bands doing something a bit different as well. It's really important for our culture that we keep doing stuff like that.
Absolutely. So this final episode of the series is all about women in banding, something that I can talk a lot about and do talk a lot about, but we've got some special pieces from the archive to discuss, as well as lots of different characters who have really defined this area of banding. I would say, in terms of the archival stuff, it's a little bit more recent history than some other things that we've talked about in this series. A lot of people have really seen and witnessed the change happening before them. What has that been like for you? Were women there in your band when you first started playing?
I think the long-term view of this is really interesting. I mean, we just spoke about the 170th British Open. I'd imagine for about at least the first 100 of them, there was probably no women involved at all. My banding life goes back over 50 years. There was a family in our band. Two of the daughters were in the band, and there was another older woman in the band at the same time, which was unusual at that time, early 70s in central Scotland. It was unusual to have three women in the band at that time, because most still didn't have any. Once you moved up to the championship section, there were virtually none at that time. But it really was a curiosity, and a lot of women were just not welcome in some bands as well, especially the more industry-based bands would just never have entered their heads that a woman might be good enough to play for them, which is an unbelievable concept when you think about it. But that's where the culture was. So yeah, I do remember there was a band in Kilmarnock which was formed as the Kilmarnock Youth Band in late 1969 or 70, around there. And the conductor was a guy called Andrew Keachy, who was a trumpet player, but he was the local brass teacher. And he taught everybody in the band, and quite a good percentage of them were girls at that time. They moved up through the sections, they did very, very well. They won prizes at the national finals. And in 1979, they won the Scottish Championships, top section, and played at the Royal Albert Hall. There was an early example, I guess. probably one of the first bands to make a big impact at that level that had a good percentage of females in the band. And they were all very young players in their late teens and early 20s at the most. But a fantastic achievement. But to think that they did it in an all-male environment.
Yeah.
A band that was probably 30 to 40% women at the time. Really fantastic. But it's been a long journey, and in many ways, you know, there's a lot for us not to be proud of, I guess, in there as well. Even 40 years ago or so, when I was first at Whitburn, we had 2 ladies in the band. And again, we'd go and play at the Albert Hall, and they were a curiosity. They'd get their picture in the bandsman. There's a band here with 2 girls in it.
Yeah.
Desford had 1 or 2. Foden's around about that time were 1 or 2. But most of the top bands it just wasn't for them.
And I suppose a big reason for that, as we talked about in previous episodes, the way that most bands were born from industry, so the players were male working class. So it does take time to move away from that and shift what the band was.
Yeah, and I think we've got to really point to people like Howard Snell, who obviously an absolutely top-class musician that had no prejudice in that direction at all, and was one of the first to realise clearly, actually, some of these women can play a bit, and some fantastic players started to come through in the 1980s through bands like Desford and Foden's that Howard was involved, Co-op in Glasgow as well. But really pushing them into the limelight when very, very few conductors had done that previously. Howard was one of the first to really change that world, and it was great. I can still remember back in the 1980s watching bands like Foden's playing and making a real impact with proper, good players who just happened to be female.
Yeah. You've had a busy weekend of banding, and there's been some female-led highlights, I would say. One of them being our Elevate artist, Rebecca, who was paired with Weymouth Concert Brass, so a female composer being featured, but also the first female adjudicator at the British Open, which is fairly amazing.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, one that's pretty close to home as well. Obviously, Mrs. Crookston has made a fantastic impact at the weekend. It's a ridiculous statistic.
Yeah, we're still having firsts, which is crazy.
I'm not even sure it's anybody's fault. It feels like they've just never got around to it. But yeah, she did a great job. She seemed to be very warmly accepted by the audience at the start and the end of the contest, which is a double bonus, I guess, for the adjudicator still to be getting praise at the end. No, she got that invitation a few months ago and obviously had to keep it a bit quiet, but she put an enormous amount of work into the preparation of the piece, as much as any conductor did, I'm sure. As you'd expect every adjudicator to do in every situation, but it's a very high pressure appointment, especially being a bit under the microscope. I guess what's probably slightly less known is that in adjudication terms, I think it's something like her 75th or 76th adjudication. She actually had more experience than the 2 gentlemen, Luke Vertommen and Stephen Cobb, 2 fine musicians, but she's actually got more adjudicating experience than the 2 put together. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people saying, oh, they've got a woman in the box, isn't that nice?
Isn't that novel?
Yeah, so she's always super well prepared. She really enjoyed the experience as well. Truly a unique experience, but she really enjoyed every moment of it.
So on that note, I'm going to speak to Annie Crookston all about her journey and some of the barriers that she's faced to get her to this amazing point, being the first woman adjudicator at the British Open. I'm joined by Annie Crookston. We're now just under a week after the British Open, where you were the first female adjudicator. How was that experience for you?
Do you know, it was a fantastic experience. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. The whole thing from being asked by Bob way back all those months ago to the whole process and then in the box on the day, it really was one of the most proud moments of my life. Fantastic experience again, working with really great musicians, and then the day itself listening to fantastic bands. The whole thing, it was absolutely wonderful.
Amazing. Well, there was certainly a lot of positive praise, which was great. And, you know, there's always some niggling with the decision in the box, but I think there was a lot of respect there for you and the speech that you made, which is really great to see.
Yeah, it was. It was a lovely reception at the beginning of the day, and then at the end when I spoke, it was just a fantastic reception.
Obviously, we're still seeing a lot of these firsts happen with women in banding.
Absolutely.
Why do you think that in adjudication in particular, we're still seeing these firsts coming through?
That's a difficult question because it's a very particular part of the banding world. It's such an unusual thing, the 2 halves of what we do as brass bands, and that in particular is quite a niche thing. Although there are more opportunities now, for women, it feels like it takes a long time to get opportunities, and there are so few contests throughout the banding year that limits opportunities as well. It's nice to see that there are more women doing that, but I think over the years, and certainly in the time that I've been doing it, there haven't been that many opportunities to work at an elite level, if you like, the championship level. So there's maybe that, and it is a male-dominated world. So that shrinks the opportunities even further. It is a difficult one. I'm not really sure why that is. And then there's maybe that mindset as well. It's maybe not quite what women want to do. I'm not really sure why that should be the case. It shouldn't be, because there are lots of fantastic women performers, conductors. I don't really know why it's the case that it is so male dominated.
Yeah, I think something that we've spoken to a lot of participants on female-led and specific projects before is confidence. You have to be so sure of your opinion with adjudication, and maybe that's part of it.
Yes, there'll be that. And certainly you do feel in some occasions that you do have to over-prepare, not just adjudicating, but in conducting. You feel like you have to over-prepare just to be on a par. So there's that as well. The experience last week was just fantastic, but it did change everything that I did. I did have to rethink my own process leading up to the contest. I spent a long time, because I've known about it for a few months. I've known about it since March, early March, something like that, knowing that this is the biggest contest on the planet. I did change my own approach to it. We did many contests throughout the summer. I was really fortunate to do that. And I practiced judging, making my own comments more succinct. So I spent less time writing. That's probably the biggest change that I made. My comments were more succinct, but I spent more time listening. I felt that the preparation that I'd done for this contest was much more in depth because I had longer to do it. Even going to Stonehenge and trying to get into the head of the composer. And if it's possible, really just being as much immersed in the story. I've never prepared for a contest in as much depth as I did for this one. But I think that's the beauty of it as well, because I've come out the other side better for it. It's definitely changed me as a listener, as a judge, and for the better as well. So I would recommend it to anyone. And again, you're working with fantastic musicians. Even that in itself, it's so wonderful. And I do feel a better musician for it.
Yeah. Well, like you say, it's a craft that you've got to work on. You can't just rely on doing a couple of contests a year and then that's going to see you through. You've got to develop that skill.
Yeah. You really do have to keep working on it as well, even that process of listening, because apart from anything else, it's such a huge responsibility. And bands expect you to be giving them your full attention from the first note that they play to the last note that they play, every single bar. And it doesn't matter what draw you get as a judge, you have to be on it from beginning to the end of the day. And whether your day's 9 hours long or 2 hours long, it doesn't matter. That's the responsibility because of their investment. It's an investment of time. Every member of the family will be involved because there'll be childcare, there'll be financial investment as well. It's such a huge responsibility. So yes, there's the craft, but there's that knowledge that you want to make sure you're doing every single band justice and making sure that everybody gets a fair and equal hearing. That has to be something that you keep in the back of your mind as you prepare and putting in as much preparation as they would, go to rehearsals twice a week. There's your core values when it comes to judging. Give the band their fair hearing and do them justice, as a person.
Definitely. So, Annie, could you tell us a little bit more about your journey into adjudicating? You said it's quite a long journey to get to the British Open, but how did you start and how did you break through into that world?
It's quite a long journey, actually, when I think back, because I am a music teacher by profession. So I guess part of that job and that assessment of performance in schools. But early on in my career, we participated in lots of music festivals, being asked to judge. But it wasn't really until Norway actually asked me to go and judge Sidis. And I think it's maybe about 2005. And I've been judging smaller band contests maybe for about 5 or 6 years, but around about 2005 I was asked to go and be part of the jury for the Sidis contest, which is an entertainment contest in Norway every November. At that time they were operating a kind of positive discrimination policy, I guess, because all of the panels at that particular contest, it was a 50-50 split, so it was one male judge, one women judge. So that really was the start of it. And then after that, I guess it was kind of word of mouth. I'd been asked to do a couple of area contests, and then it built up from there gradually. So I have been getting that experience every year since then, really consistently, and you just build that up from there. But I suppose along with that is the playing side of things. I've been playing in good bands, really, with great players, listening to great players, great conductors throughout my entire life. So that experience has been the journey of a lifetime, really.
Yeah. As well as an adjudicator, you're, of course, a conductor and a teacher and a million and one other things.
Yes.
How do you feel as a conductor? What do you feel like the balance is like in that role at the moment with female representation?
It's a similar position. If I look back to the contest that I've taken the band to, there have been times when I've been the only woman conducting. And for a long, long time, that was the case. There have been one or two women in England, certainly not that many in Scotland for a very long time. It's changing now, but that balance wasn't quite there. And I guess part of my thinking in terms of adjudicating as well was I kind of wanted to know what that was like from the box to help me as a conductor. So the two went hand in hand, but the imbalance is still there now with conducting. There aren't that many women conductors, but the women that are conducting are successful. Yeah. They do great things with the bands that they take, and we now begin to see many, many more. So it's great to see, but it's only now that that's beginning to shift.
And it must be quite lonely being at a contest and being the only female conductor, I'm sure. There will be very specific barriers and challenges that present themselves being one of the sole women in that kind of space. What has that been like for you?
I think it's been mixed. More so early on, there were the usual kind of people trying to see if you were, I guess, musically sound to stand in front of the band. And there had been a couple of times in the past when players might have deliberately maybe not played what was on the score. I'll just test it out, see if she picks that up. So there were things like that early on. I'm not sure that I had been aware of maybe how lonely it is because I'm so familiar with that world. I've been a player for more than 40 years and in that world for a long time, so it didn't really feel lonely from that point of view. I've certainly noticed when the opportunities weren't quite coming along that perhaps, maybe not that I deserved, but certainly that there weren't the same opportunities for me as there were for other conductors. I felt a bit of injustice there. I feel I've lived with that throughout my career. I've conducted for a long time, adjudicated for a long time, and that's kind of the way it is. And it's only now when you see more women conductors coming along that you think, yeah, they're great conductors. They should be getting the opportunities as well.
You mentioned that Norway had policies around positive discrimination. Do you feel like those kind of positive discrimination policies are needed to get us where we need to be?
That's a difficult one as well because they didn't really continue with that policy after that, although they do always have great women judges on their panels and have done for all of these years. And maybe that was the starting point. It should be on merit. You get the place on an adjudication panel or a jury according to merit, regardless of gender. It really should be like that. That was the starting point. And it certainly opened doors for me. There's no doubt about that. I'm not sure that positive discrimination policy, and even calling it that, is the right way to go. Even the policy for picking adjudicators, it's word of mouth so there's a barrier there from the start. You know, if contest organisers are picking their panels, they're really sticking to what they know, without looking beyond the boundaries of the people they always go to. There's a barrier there. There's a challenge there right away. I don't think the positive discrimination policy is the way to go, but if contest controllers just open their eyes to the wider world, look what's happening, look at the great things that women are doing, playing-wise, conducting-wise, it feels like it's an easy fix to me.
Yeah, and certainly for the youth champs, we've done an open call for adjudicators. We haven't found it an issue to get a balanced high quality panel, in our opinion, but there's lots of people who come to us with all the skills but haven't necessarily adjudicated before, and it's just a case of supporting them to give that a go.
Absolutely. And that support is really vital as a contest controller. It's been really clear about your expectations of the judges that you're choosing. What are your expectations in terms of exactly what you're looking for from them, and being clear about that. And I think certainly over the years, that's not always been the case. It's maybe still prevalent now. You need some very clear guidance. Judges do need that support, and especially if you are a wee bit inexperienced, that's absolutely vital.
Yeah, and I'm sure adjudicating at Brass in Concert or Sidis is a world away from adjudicating at the nationals, which is a world away from adjudicating at the youth champs as well. It's all very, very different.
There are different requirements. You are bringing with you your entire musical experience, whether it's the youth champs or the national. You do bring your entire life's journey as a musician with you. But what you would want an adjudicator to be saying to a youth band in your remarks would be very different from a brass and concert or nationals or the open. Very different. And as an adjudicator, your job really is to be aware of all those, to be in sync with what youth bands are doing, to be listening to performances, to be preparing yourself for that, and that awareness that a championship band at the Open or the National will want something very different from you than a youth band or lower section bands even as well. So it's having that awareness. It really is a craft, and you do really need to nurture that.
So for any young women, or not so young women, who would be interested in exploring adjudicating or conducting, and they don't really know what to do, what would be your advice?
One of the most important things, not just for young women, but young people in particular, if you are interested in judging, listen to as wide a range of music as you possibly can. And I don't just mean brass bands, particularly soloists. Listen to singers. How do singers present themselves? How do they deliver melodies? That's where you start from. What are your opinions as an adjudicator? What is it that speaks to you? And for me, I think all of my life, it's really been that storytelling connection. That's a really important aspect. Listen to a wide range of music. You really do need to practice the skill of a written commentary, and it doesn't need to be much. Just why did you like that performance? What was it about it that spoke to you? Hone those skills, talk it through in your mind. And in all of the contests that I've judged with all of the musicians that I've worked with, I have never come across any two systems of judging that are the same. So it's thinking that part of it through as well, because it is quite a technical part of the process, listening and writing those comments, but coming to a decision about where you're placing those performances and why. You need to develop how you work most comfortably. It is a real craft to be able to do that, write and form an opinion as you go along, and especially in a contest where you might not get a lot of time in between. And then talk to other people. Talk to other people about what performances you like, why did they like that performance, and begin to form those opinions. So that's the technical part of the judging process. In terms of getting those opportunities, there is the Association of Brass Band Adjudicators, ABBA. There is that training process, which is quite a meticulous process. That will give you all the practical skills. And they have a performance criteria pack, which is helpful as a guideline. And then I guess in terms of the opportunities that you get, because as I said earlier, there aren't that many contests in a year. And whether it is being a bit forthcoming with yourself and putting yourself out there and approaching contests and contest controllers, shadowing, if that is something you could do, go and shadow. You know, the way things are, that's how you would begin to get the opportunities. Be present, go to the British Open, go to the National, go to area contests that you can go to the Festival of Brass, go to Brass and Concert. If you can get to contests on the continent and Scandinavian countries, do that as well and be interested in it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Annie. It's been so great to speak to you. We're delighted for you that you had that opportunity, and I hope that we'll continue seeing you in the way that you absolutely should be at more and more of these contests. So thank you so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you, Sarah.
So you watch a lot of bands. What do you think the state of play right now is? Do you think that we have achieved balance, or do you think we've still got a long way to go?
I think we're getting there. I mean, I don't think there's many bands that wouldn't give a female player an opportunity because they're so good. And we actually did a bit of an experiment at the weekend. I was sitting in the audience with Nigel and Sarah Stevens. Nigel's on the BBE board and he's the chief executive of Brass and Concert. But Sarah kept a list of every female player on stage in each band. And there was one band in 11, Oldham, had 11 females in the band. The lowest number was 3. There's still a bit of work to be done in that band. It's a work in progress, isn't it, still?
Yeah.
I guess we'd love to see a time when it's 50-50. But that was the British Open, and the average was probably about 7 or 8.
Yeah.
So a quarter of the players or so are the highest level of competition. Yeah. And the most traditional high-level competition as well. So it's getting there, but we've got a lot of work to do. We've got the national finals coming up at Cheltenham this weekend. I guess it would be quite interesting to see the gender balance there will probably be slightly different, I would guess. I'd imagine there'd be more in sections 1 to 4.
And I think there are still big barriers in place. We'll talk a little bit later on about what some of those might have been. But to play in a competitive band, in a highly ranking competitive band, is a huge commitment, time commitment, travel commitment, all of that kind of stuff. It's still hard, particularly if you've got a young family, but it's hard to do.
That's the thing. And some of the bands that we're talking about who are there at the weekend, they will have a lot of engagements during the year, often taking up the whole weekend. And if you have got a young family, that pressure is there. And we have to recognise that. And it doesn't matter if it's a brass band or a football team or a cricket team or a choir or whatever people do in their leisure time. But when you've got something like a band that you have to be committed to it at that level, I guess it's very, very difficult for family women to be making that commitment.
Next, we're going to speak to someone who thinks about the state of play in women in banding a lot, because it's what she spends all of her time on her PhD researching. We're going to speak to Marrianne Garbutt, who is a current PhD researcher at the University of Salford. Hi, Marrianne. How are you doing?
Hi, Sarah. How are you? It's lovely to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm very excited about this topic, and I know you are too. It's something that you spend a lot of your time thinking about, writing about, and researching.
And talking about it so much to anyone who will listen.
Exactly. So our mind went straight to you when we were thinking about guests for this particular episode. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your research and what it encompasses?
So my research is about women in brass bands in the areas of performance, conducting, composition, adjudication, and positions of leadership and authority. Mm-hmm. I've got to concentrate on British brass banding. Mm-hmm. It would be amazing to be able to contrast what's happening in Britain with Europe, around the world. New Zealand and Australia would be absolutely fascinating. Norway would be incredible to look at, because the situation is quite different across there, but it's too wide a topic for PhD research. So I've got to focus on British brass banding. So yeah, I've been studying for about 6 or 7 years now. It seems like such a long time, but it's good to have that length of time because so much has happened in such a short space of time. We've seen so much change that it's amazing to be able to document it in real life. So it's great from that perspective. It's not great for my bank balance and my anxiety levels are often through the roof as I try to study alongside a full-time job.
Yeah. But yeah, tracking such a interesting time for brass banding. Obviously, your findings early on in your research will have changed and your thoughts will have changed. What are some of the standout areas and really impactful areas that have come to light for you over the course of your research?
So obviously, you're talking as little as 15 to 20 years ago. We didn't have women involved in brass banding at the elite level. Women just weren't allowed to play in those kind of bands. I remember the press release that went out when Brighouse started to have their first 2 women involved in banding. And it was such an amazing piece of news. But you're sitting there reading it and you're thinking, really? It's like the 2000s.
Yeah.
How has it taken this long? Yeah. For goodness sake. I think probably the stat that stands out for me in performance is around 30% of the performers in British brass banding are women or identify as women. Around 5% of the bands are conducted by women. Around 8% of adjudicators are women. I challenge every single one of you to think about when the last time you played a piece by a woman composer was, and when the last time a piece written by a woman was used in a national competition, or indeed the regionals, which essentially operate at a national level.
Yeah. Judith Bingham will be the name that comes to mind for a lot of people.
Yeah, 2003.
And the reception received from that piece, I think, is significant.
Absolutely. She received hate mail.
Yeah.
She's an internationally acclaimed prize-winning composer, and she's receiving hate mail for a piece of music that she's written.
Yeah.
It honestly, it beggars belief.
Yeah.
It's incredible, really.
As much as on the social media groups and various other platforms, people comment and sometimes moan and sometimes celebrate pieces that are chosen, you can't quite imagine a scenario where it would lead to that now.
Absolutely.
I think it's fair to say from your research so far that you feel that the British banding scene is not balanced right now.
Definitely. So I talked about the 30% of women performers, but within that, there's disparity. There are a lot more women performing, a lot more women conducting in the lower sections than there are in the championship sections. I've got the stats to prove that now. That's been part of my research. Why that is, I mean, you can look at all sorts of historical reasons. Women weren't involved in the elite level banding, so they've not got the solo seats. You've not got the role models to aspire to. So it's natural that there will be some kind of progression and that there will be more in grassroots banding than there are at elite levels. I hope to see that change. I'd like to think that that would change. Similar situation in conducting, where you've got a lot more women conductors in the third and fourth section than you do in the championship section. It'll be interesting to see the stats that come out following the British Open, how many women conductors we've got at the British Open. I don't think it'll be many, if any. Certainly the figures from last year would suggest that they are few and far between at that kind of level. Got to say, when we're talking about calling out things that have improved over the time that I've been looking at these stats, adjudication is one of the stats that has improved the most. We've still got areas where we're not so good at it, but I think the regional contest has massively improved the numbers of women adjudicators, which is terrific. The Association of Brass Band Adjudicators are doing a lot of work in that area, and it's just lovely to see women coming forward, women being encouraged to get into that area. Brass Bands England encouraging women to develop themselves for the youth championships, and long may it continue. And hopefully we'll improve from the stats of 8%. Traditionally, it's seen as a reward, isn't it? Adjudication. You get to a certain level in performing, then you might take up the stick. You get to a certain level in conducting, and then you're asked to adjudicate at a contest. So we've got a way to go, and we can see the pathway. But my question is, why do we have to wait for that to happen? Why can't we push forward with it? We can see that there is inequity. So why don't we do something about it now?
And this is something that we've definitely found speaking to young people and participants in projects, and when we're looking at what we're going to programme, role models comes up again and again, the importance of seeing familiarity and knowing that that's a safe space for them to step into. And that comes in with women in banding, but other areas of diversity too. Is there any kind of significant role models or something that you've seen happening in the last few years that you go, oh yes, that's it, more of that could solve it?
I mean, not wanting to kiss any bums, but the work that Brass Bands England are doing is really good. The work that you're doing, the work that Rosie's doing, the work that Jess is doing. I know Jess really well, so yeah, I'm sure she won't mind me calling her out. But also getting out into the community and drawing attention to these things is really important. The work that Shona Wade is doing in adjudication, the work that Katrina Marcella is doing in conducting with the schemes that she's organised in Yorkshire and in Scotland with the Army Band, all of that is really, really important. The work that Andrea Price is doing.
Yeah.
So Andrea Price has just been announced as the composer of the fourth section regionals for next year, which is absolutely terrific. Andrea Price is a composer. She's also an extraordinarily talented performer and conductor. She just ticks all of those boxes. It's sickening how talented she is and such a lovely person to boot. It's a piece based on Greek mythology. It's very descriptive, it's very programmatic, and the bands are really going to enjoy getting their teeth into it. It's going to be a wonderful piece, and I just hope it provides a role model for young women nowadays. There's so much talent out there in composition. There are so many young women who aspire to do it, but they just don't see it happening. We don't choose test pieces that are written by women. So we're losing these pieces. We're losing these women. They're just not writing for brass bands anymore. They're turning to a different medium, and that's a real shame. So it's absolutely terrific that Andrea's been chosen for this, and I'm utterly delighted for her, dead proud of her and everything that she's done. And yeah, can't wait to hear it.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing news. And I've worked with Andrea as an adjudicator and as a composer. She was a mentor on a composing block that we ran with AMP, which was very specifically focused on getting women engaged in composition. She's just such a fantastic musician.
Incredible musician.
I'm so excited to hear what that looks like. Like you say, if we've got more pieces that are going to be played more regularly, I think that's such a big hurdle to get over. And if it is an accessible piece that people want to play, that makes such a difference in it getting heard.
But is it enough? Again, like we alluded to at the beginning, we've waited since 2003 to see another women composer hit the echelons of composition in that respect. When was the last time that a piece was used for the British Open? Mm-hmm. You've got to go back to the 60s to find that. And that was Helen Perkin when she produced Carnival and Island Heritage. You look at the Nationals, and there's never, ever been a piece written by a woman used for the Nationals. So we've got a lot of work to do in composition. But I think we need to remember that the music is out there.
Yeah.
We just need to look a bit harder for it. And I think every single conductor in the country needs to take responsibility for that. It's all very well us sitting here saying, oh, there's no decent music written by a woman. There's loads of it out there. You just have to look at Share My Yoke that was written by Joy Webb. And we've been playing it for years and not shouting about the fact that it's written by a woman. Yeah. There are tons of women composers out there that are just dying to compose for brass bands. We need to find them. And every single one of us should take responsibility for doing that. If I can issue a challenge to everyone, find at least 2 women composers in your area that you can work with and do program it into your concerts, please. And it doesn't need to be the focus of your entire concert. You know, it can be a march, it could be a solo, it could be anything. But make sure you've got a piece by a woman in there. We've seen that happening in orchestras. It's happening more and more in orchestras. Some orchestras are now programming about 50% of the music. Goodness, do you think we could ever get to that stage in brass bands? We'll see. But yeah, I'd like to issue a challenge to everyone to programme some music by a women composer for your next concert.
It kind of goes hand in hand with commissioning as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And having a focus on commissioning, because there is a reduced pool of female composers and works to pick from. So if you're not active in new commissions, it's going to be harder. And it's time cost and it's expensive to commission and all of that kind of stuff. But ultimately, if we want to see more of that music, that's what we've got to do. We've got to support those people in creating that music. I know that certainly Fulham Brass Band have done really, really active work on this. They set themselves a challenge. They felt it was just something that the band really wanted to push towards, and it's totally possible. Grimethorpe have done some really active commissioning for women composers, and Liz Lane is their composer in residence. Again, a wonderful writer, produces lots of great accessible work for bands to engage with. So it's out there. You've just got to make the effort.
Yeah, do your own research.
You can do it.
Absolutely. The schemes that have been going on in Europe have seen such amazing music being produced for the British Open. This year's test piece is produced in conjunction with so many different European countries and the brass bands in those countries. If we could get a woman composer to do that, then that would be incredible, because you're getting it out to so many different people. So much music is going to be produced from that. It would be terrific. We absolutely need to get to a point where we've got more equity. I'm not asking for it to be 50-50. Be nice if it was, but we need to be realistic about what we're asking for at the moment. And we also need male allies. We need men who are in these positions of leadership and authority to be standing up for us, to point out the inequity, to point out the injustice. We need role models to be coming through. You can't aspire to anything if you've not got someone to look up to.
I think that's such a good point. And we're supporting a member quite recently, and a situation around inequity came up. And we had this exact conversation. It's kind of, oh, who's going to deal with it? And the conversation's going to be had. And I said, oh, it feels like a bit of a cop-out to send the men in to deal with it. It feels like we're sending the guys in. And then I went, actually, no. No, it's not. They should be doing it. They should be the ones that are having that conversation. And I think we forget that a lot. There's a lot of women who are fighting the cause and still doing that. But actually, yeah, a call to men in banding to also join that fight.
Absolutely. And I'm very lucky in the people that I've got round about me who are very supportive, men who are very supportive, my husband, but also the conductor of the band who I'm with at the moment, the chairman of the band that I'm with at the moment, and the guy who I share travel arrangements with. And they all have spent hours listening to me talking about this topic. They are as passionate about it as I am. And they're coming to me as soon as something comes out on social media, they're coming to me going, oh, have you seen that? What do you think about it? What can we do about it? Yeah. So watch this space for some good news coming out of Leyland Band in the near future, hopefully. It's just so important to be having these conversations with your band about what's happening round about you. You know, if you see something happening, then do call it out, do call attention to it, do your own research as well. Be aware of what's happening. Yeah. That's really important.
It's a good reminder that BBE are here as a support organisation. That's what we are. We are a body to support you. And if you feel like you are having issues or you want to do some positive action around this area, that's all great and we want to hear about it. And we're here to help you through difficult times and through troubles and through great successes as well. So please don't be afraid to come and tell us about stuff that's going on in your band room. We absolutely want to hear about it.
Absolutely.
It would be great to dig a little bit more into how you've collected the information for your PhD and your research and what's been available to you. Has that been difficult to find information about women in bands?
Yeah, when I started this, I didn't wear glasses and I didn't have any grey hair. So there has been a lot of trawling on the internet, looking through 4 Bars Rest contest pages, looking through pictures on individual bands' websites, going to contests and sitting there and counting how many women are on stage. The World of Brass streaming service was extremely helpful last year. I was able to sit on my couch and count how many women were performing at the Europeans. I did it for the whole of the Europeans, and then I did it again for the British Open. But yeah, it's very difficult to find records for any of this kind of information. I did approach the registry, but apparently it's a GDPR issue, so they weren't able to help me. So I've had to think outside the box and approach it differently. I have sat there counting women. So I fully admit that my stats might not be particularly accurate. So much fashion is homogenous nowadays, isn't it? So looking back into the archives, sitting looking at all those fuzzy little photographs, trying to see if there's any men and women, differentiate between them. It's quite hard. People sitting behind one another in photographs and things like that. But it's important that it's done. I've got lots of spreadsheets that detail how many women there were in each of the bands and in which position they played, whether in a solo seat, which instrument they've played and things like that. So it's all building up into a really good database that maybe after I've completed my studies, we'll be able to release somewhere, and hopefully it will be of use to someone else in the future.
Amazing. Yeah, no, absolutely. I would love to see it. And I guess particularly taking data from photos and live streams, stuff like that, there'll be a lot of assumption in there about the way that women present as well, I guess, that you have to kind of make a call on, and bands often wearing exactly the same uniform and no differentiation must make things quite tricky for you.
Yeah, it really is hard. You've kind of got like a 2-point process. So you can see the information on the screen and then you can go back to the band's website and hopefully back up what you're saying with information from that as well. But it's so difficult to get your band website up to date nowadays. Yes. That's another issue. I wish bands would keep their personnel up to date on their websites.
Yes, absolutely. So you've still got a bit of your research to go. As a researcher, what would be really valuable for you to find in an archive that would support you? What is like a gem that you would just go, oh, that would be amazing if you stumbled across it?
It would be incredible to have a full list of the bands with dates of the first woman that played in them, who she was, what she played, how long she stayed with the band, any information you can provide about her. Similarly, if you've got any women conductors, when were they associated with the band? What did they do? Did they take the band to the British Open? People like Betty Anderson, we've got lots of information about Betty when she conducted rugby co-op at the British Open. Having that information relating to the first woman that ever played at the British Open, the first woman to ever play in the championship section at the Nationals, that sort of information would be absolutely incredible. But yeah, just having more up-to-date information available as records would be incredible. And I think it would be so revealing as well.
Definitely. It's worth saying that we are still in the process of cataloguing the original collection that came to us, but we also have new acquisitions that come to us. We've had some real gems donated recently, but as with lots of other things, we want to make active efforts to make sure that there is good representation and accurate representation in our archive. So if you have material that relates specifically to women or people of a global majority or LGBTQ representation, we would absolutely love to see it. And because that isn't well represented at the moment, that would help us balance the collection that we have. So we'd absolutely love to hear about it. And do email our archivist Danny. She would love to hear from you if you have anything that you would like to see represented in the archive. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's a topic that you are so passionate about, and I always love speaking to you about it. It's always so informative. I can't wait to see where your research ends up. It's so exciting to see. And I hope everyone takes on board Marrianne's challenges that she has issued to you today. Every little helps.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak as part of this podcast. I do love talking about this topic. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me and let me know about the important women in their bands, I'd love to hear about it as well. These stories are so important. And that's maybe something that we can carry on into the archive, is getting these stories recognised, getting them in the history books. Because if you look at the history books, there are not very many women there at all at the moment. At the moment is the important thing.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thank you so much, Sarah.
No problem. We've got the opportunity to make history there, as Marrianne says. So we'd love to hear from you.
Herstory.
Yeah, history. Make history. Thanks so much, Marrianne.
Thank you.
That was 4 Minute Mile by Judith Bingham, played by the Black Dyke Band. I think it's fair to say that Judith is quite a significant figure when it comes to women in banding.
I'd quite like to think that might have been a bit of a turning point in a good way, given the reaction to her piece Prague, which was an area test piece for the qualifying contest for the national finals in 2003, the championship section. And the reaction to it was just frankly ridiculous. And I'm sure if her name had been George Bingham or Jimmy Bingham or something like that, it would have been completely different. Because it was actually a really good piece. I remember playing it. It was difficult, usual, very many different standards of performance of it. But it was just a good piece of music that had become stigmatised almost by the fact that it had been criticised so much in our community. I remember actually meeting her. There was a brass day at the proms in 2007, and they did a big community performance on the steps outside, and she'd written a piece for that. It was basically a come along and play thing.
Yeah.
Quite an elementary piece. There was a lot of young players involved. And I went and introduced myself. I was the editor of the British Bandsman at the time. And she visibly winced when she'd seen that I was somebody from brass bands.
Yeah.
And I can still remember her reaction. And we had a really nice, friendly conversation after that, but it was a real reaction to brass bands. This was 4 years later. She was still affected by it.
Yeah.
A lot of unfair criticism at the time, and anybody would be affected in some way by it.
Yeah.
So she rightly had a bit of a chip on her shoulder about brass bands. And for what reason? Because she'd written a test piece for a band contest that was, it wasn't Gilbert Vinter or Eric Ball we were listening to. It was a different style. It was a much more modern style. But in terms of being a good piece of music, it was tremendous. Yeah, I think a dark day for brass bands. But I think we've done better than that since then. I think we've looked at ourselves a bit since then and said, well, really, that's not good enough. We have to do better collectively.
Yeah.
And I think we have as well.
Yeah, and she writes fantastic music. That piece that we just heard, Prague as well, and lots of others. But yeah, if that's a reaction that you'd had from a whole sector, a piece that you'd written, yeah, you would hold that with you, absolutely. And we do need positive action to make sure that those kind of things don't happen again, that we really put a line in the sand and say, no, well, of course it's not acceptable. If we're going to move forward here, then we've got to make some active steps to make that happen.
Yeah, and events like the Royal Northern Festival and other ones have made a real effort to bring a bit of equality to it. We can still do better, though. I'm sure we've all got thoughts on events that could do better in promoting equality. It's not even promoting females, it's promoting equality.
Yeah.
But we have come a long way since the 1980s. I can remember there was a young euphonium player, Wendy Picton was her name. She was from Wigan. She was a terrific young euphonium player in the late 70s, early 80s. And she was quite often appearing in newspapers and on the television. She did really well in the BBC Young Musician of the Year.
Yeah.
But there was a subplot to the whole thing, which was that she was a good euphonium player, but she couldn't play for a top band because she was female. Never ever found out what happened to her, actually. She just disappeared from banding. Went away and did something better, but she'd have been made more welcome, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thankfully, though, since then, I mean, as we said earlier, opportunities started presenting themselves. Players like Carol Crompton playing with Desford when they won the National in 1987. In 1987, it took 87 years from the first one in 1900 for a female to be in the winning band. Linda Nicholson, only 4 years later, was the principal cornet player, the same winning band in Desford at the National. So real trailblazers again that have managed to kind of break through and do it at the very, very top. Of course, the last few years, players like Shona White and Katrina Marzella and others, just the very best of what they do.
Yeah. You look at some of those barriers that were in place then, not just that you're walking into a room full of men and you're in a uniform that's very much created for a male body and all of those things that are kind of designed to make you feel a bit uncomfortable.
It's interesting actually sitting watching an event like the British Open,
Yeah.
and you see the different takes on the uniform and how different bands approach the gender balance on the uniform, I guess. Most of them are just all wearing trousers nowadays, but there was times when they were wearing different lengths of skirts and whatever. And I guess that always has been up for criticism with some people as well.
Yeah, it's a balance, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you see the bands that take the approach that everyone's wearing the same uniform because of that uniformity, and that makes sense. And then sometimes the guys will be in the uniform, but women will be in black dress. And actually, more often than not, that just highlights how few women there are in the band.
Yeah.
And it makes them stand out in a situation where the whole setup and design of a band looking like that is about uniformity.
Yeah.
Which is a weird juxtaposition.
Well, the one thing we did find out on Saturday is you don't have to have the best looking uniforms to sound the best. the Swiss band, Tres Etoiles, they look like my old school uniform from the 1970s, but they certainly don't play like that, I can assure you.
There have been some amazing female players throughout the years who have trailblazed through these various barriers. For example, it was a long, long time before women would have been allowed on the bus to go to a contest.
Oh, there's plenty of examples of bands that wouldn't let a woman on the bus. If they were going to London for the weekend for the championships, they would have sent a separate bus with the wives and girlfriends on it.
Yeah, I think that just sends such a signal about what people felt like the space of the band room was, what the social feeling was about it. It was blokes there to do their thing.
I guess even the premises in a lot of cases would just have been unsuitable.
Yeah. Setups in working men's clubs, for example, probably wasn't a female toilet, like really basic things
There
like
might not have been a male toilet.
Well, yeah. Yeah, so it's just not suitable. And then the timeline for change, I guess. We talk about the changes that happened in championship banding a lot because that kind of trickled down. But it was into the millennium before some bands had female players in those championship bands, which feels ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, but true. Yeah, it's even in the last 15 years or so.
Yeah.
One or two of the last ones to the party, very well-known bands as well. And as I said, some of the ones who were later have given real great opportunities to females, as they would to any player since then. So arrived late, but got there in the end.
So next, we're going to speak to another researcher. Sarah is one of our volunteers that supports us with the Brass Band Archive. She's done a number of blogs for us focusing on women in banding. So Kenny's going to speak to her to find out a little bit more about her research.
Sarah Crowe is a PhD researcher who has written a blog on the BBE website on women in the spotlight. Sarah has also done research into the subject at the University of Gloucester, and her master's thesis was an examination of the challenges faced by female brass musicians in Britain from 1870 to 1920. Sarah, your research looks at the change in role of women during the Industrial Revolution as well. So why exactly were so few women involved in banding at that time?
Most of the bands I discovered really came about at that time through workplace bands, factories, that type of thing, really. It was generally to give the men a healthy pursuit, something to do other than drinking. There was a big sort of anti-drinking movement at the time. Due to the fact that it was mainly men in those settings, the origin of the bands really came about through being largely sort of male oriented. And that's really how it continued. Although there have always been some family bands, less often wives, but quite often if the sons were all learning, some of the daughters would learn as well. And then you would get occasionally a family band kind of setting in Yorkshire and sort of around the Manchester area, really. But largely they tended to be male at that time. And that continued for quite a long time too.
You've mentioned there was probably quite good support for some of these kind of family connections to get women involved in banding. Was there also opposition to them?
The public found it quite shocking for a long time to see women playing brass instruments, sort of wind instruments generally. Even the music academies and other places wouldn't really accept women for a long time. They'd offer lots of places and lots of help financially for places, but it was generally for men on brass and woodwind. Women always played violin. That was seen as less shocking, but the blowing of an instrument was for a long time seen as quite a shocking thing to the public, really. It took a long time to get around that. My research has moved on more now to the Second World War era, and when women needed to step in during the war because the men were away fighting at the front, they required bands for marching, then women could step into that void. But even then, I can see that there's the same slightly horrified judgment in newspaper reports on them marching along and playing instruments and things. So, yeah, I think from a visual perspective, that lingered really for quite a long time.
One of the things you refer to in your research is about the restrictive clothing of the time that women were supposed to conform to. How did they get around that? Because I could imagine playing a brass instrument when you're squeezed into one of these tight bodices. It's going to be a pretty tricky thing to be doing.
So that was one of the things that quite surprised me, actually, that came out of that initial research for the Masters. And I think that, as much as anything, was one of the things that held women back, because it must just have been so difficult. And I did feature some studies on how much breathing capacity was lessened with these items of clothing. And there was still a need, really probably up until the First World War, for women to dress like that. So it did continue, although there were ladies' orchestras that did perform. So some of them did overcome it. They did embrace dressing up quite often in costume, which allowed for more forgiving clothing to be worn. It was for a visual, and so they could sell the band and probably get some work. But I think also it enabled them to wear some clothes that were a bit more easy to breathe in.
Tell us about some of the women who were able to break what must have been a really high glass ceiling for them at the time.
There was an amazing woman, actually, who, through the Brass Band Archive, I was studying her. She was called Daisy Squelch, and she was amazing. She was from Blackpool, and she became quite a prolific performer around the local area, but also nationally. She became quite well known and would take part in competitions against mainly male fellow contestants and do very, very well. She was amazing. So she was somebody who came about through that research. At the turn of the century, there were also several ladies' orchestras that were very popular. They just became a thing. And it was a way for women to be able to play, but also they just became a bit of a popular thing with the public to go and see, and they'd dress up in elaborate costumes and stuff. But the Baziras was one of those, and they were a troupe of female tenor horn, trombone and cornet players who played throughout Europe and here for many, many years, but couldn't really get jobs in any orchestras. So they formed their own troupe and performed very successfully. So there were these women around who people don't necessarily realise did manage to gain some level of success.
I remember seeing adverts in old programmes and, the really old editions of the British Bandsman, and one of them was Daisy Squelch doing a performance. I think it was at the Crystal Palace when the band contest was on. It was like this real curiosity. Even in my youth, though, there were relatively few women involved in banding in the early 1970s. Can you imagine, though, what it must have been like for some of these pioneers and the social atmosphere of the time?
Well, you can see through, a lot of my research has been done through the newspaper archives, because I'm very interested in the language that was used to describe them when they were on stage. And to put it not too finely, there's some pretty racy terms that are used to describe the women and how they look when they're playing. And there's a lot of, it really surprised me, actually. There's a lot of sort of concentration on their breathing and how they look in their clothes and things like that. And then at the end, it'll say, oh, and she produced a really nice sound on the cornet, having gone through this whole description of their appearance. It's just, it time and again surprised me, right up to the research I'm doing now on the Second World War, where they're describing how they look in their uniforms in a lot of detail. And then, oh, by the way, the band sounded really good. But there's a lot of breathless excitement. But also, the breathless excitement was around the fact that these women could actually do it, I think, as much as anything. And that surprise continued for a long time, that they could actually carry brass instruments when they were marching and things like this.
To be honest, it's an attitude that's still alive and well today in some quarters. And even during the 1980s, I can remember reading in the British Bandsman some fairly condescending articles, which I would like to think wouldn't pass censorship today anywhere online or in print.
Well, there's a very interesting book called How Brass Players Do It by John Ridgeon, which is still widely used. I would say to anyone listening to this, if you have a copy or can get hold of a copy, go and see the photographs of Miss Incorrect Breath wearing a bikini, who is photographed as how not to breathe when you are playing. That is one of the things that I featured in my masters, because that was printed in from the top of my head, 71, and is still in print and used today. So well, yes, there was definitely a lingering inappropriateness in some quarters still.
Looking at brass bands in general and the Brass Bands Archive in particular, is there anything really significant that you'd say has impacted on the culture of females and banding?
I think, like anything, it's a slow process, really. The more that people can see women doing these things, the more women will get into doing them, I think. I'm involved in the Lydney Training Band in the Forest of Dean. I live in Gloucester. We have, I would say, an equal number of girls and boys in the training band. And we worked out that out of around 30 players, just over 10, I think 10 or 11 are women. I mean, we're a third section band, I think. Across the sections, that differs. But I think it's bringing the cases of these players to life that are in the archives, finding their stories and telling them, whether that be the brass band archives, the newspaper archives, the national archives. I'm about to go looking for the suffragettes band that led them on marches, which not many people know about, and I'd like to try and go and find out more about them. But I think it's like all of these things. We need to tell these stories, and more women need to be seen to be playing and performing, and for it just to be a normal thing. I'm a percussionist, and I can see the shock, sometimes I still see it now, the shock in some people's faces when I sit down at the kit. I was a flugel player, but due to various problems with my embouchure, I had to stop, so I've moved to percussion. I can see shock or surprise in people's faces when I sit down at the kit, and it's just like, when is that going to not be a thing? But I want to be out there and be seen doing it so that it just becomes the norm, really. And it's the same with bringing these stories out and making them available for people to see that these people have done it, and it is possible to do, which is why it's good there. We've got a lot of girls learning, and it's pretty equal in number, which is as it should be.
Sarah, many thanks for your time today. Lovely to meet you.
Yes, and you. Thank you.
That was Fling by Andrea Price, and performed by Andrea as well, with the Black Dyke Band. So Sarah, there's quite a lot of initiatives taking place around our wonderful world of banding to help encourage equality. And you're also involved with a fantastic organisation, AMP. Used to be NIMAS, It's now AMP. You've obviously had some fantastic programmes going on over the last few years as well, so maybe you'd like to tell us about some of them.
Yeah, so we first started working with AMP nearly 5 years ago. One of the first meetings that I had was with Sarah, the director. She'd approached us because they wanted to do some focus in brass in the area with a very specific goal of supporting women to be more involved in brass in the area. She came to us to see how we could support with that. We've worked together for a long time, and following on from her working with us at BBE, I became a trustee of AMP, and I'm now the chair of AMP. So it's kind of rolled in a significant way. Mission creep, exactly. They got me eventually. So I'm very passionate about what they do, and it links so beautifully with what BBE want to do as well. They're a youth-led charity, so their programming is led by young people. They have young trustees on the board, which has been a big influence on us moving in that direction too. Our current phase of activity is on areas where we see significant barriers for women in banding. So we've had a few focus areas. Last year, our focus was on composing. We ran a specific block of work, actually led by Andrea Price, who is a fantastic composer and musician. If you see her in a composing workshop, she's just incredible. And that was very specifically for women, non-binary or non-gender conforming people to take part in that workshop. They had the opportunity to compose a short piece, and that was performed by amazing championship players at Selby Abbey in a really great performance. And they composed some challenging stuff, really challenging stuff. It was really fantastic and really, really broad ranging. Some of the participants were familiar with brass bands, but not all of them. And again, that was a really interesting way to welcome new audiences and new potential composers into the fold as well. And a lot of those people have continued to work with AMP on different projects. That was kind of the catalyst to them getting involved. We're just finishing up our second phase of work, which is focused on conductors. We did a 6-month placement with 2 conductors with the Shepherd Group Brass Band, and that was overarching mentorship by Katrina Marzella, and then a couple of kind of masterclass opportunities too. And the conversations and the feedback was just so interesting with that group of people. Confidence came up so much. That was a real issue. And what we were told pretty consistently was that it doesn't feel like there's a place where, unless someone nudges you to do it, where you could stand in front of a band, it's very hard to say, oh, I think I want to give that a go. It's not really set up in a way that you can do that easily. So it requires there to be champions of that work to push people forward. So if you have opportunities to offer out the opportunity that someone could stand in front of your band, because that might be the first chance that they've been given that option. So that came up a lot, that just the opportunity to do it was a struggle. But for just a masterclass opportunity that we held in York, we had people travelling from immense distances, people travelling up from Sussex to come for a day's workshop. It was really clear they didn't feel like that was happening anywhere else. There are lots of women out there who want to engage in this stuff. It's about making space for them to do it. And often that's the challenge. It's not about the desire to do it, it's about the opportunity. And it takes all of us to make those opportunities.
It's interesting what you're saying. A lot of the challenges that are facing young people in general also chime with that. I think it's a major challenge for a lot of brass bands to get young people involved in their management. Yeah. It's often been the case in the past when they wouldn't have been particularly welcome in the management of a lot of bands. I guess maybe some bands are paying the price for that half a generation later, when those who were there were maybe getting to kind of retirement age and finding that there's no succession plan there. Yeah,
I think it's really easy for lots of us in lots of different areas of diversity. You don't see the challenges that people not of your perspective are having. Because why would you? Because you're living in the world that you've experienced and you see those barriers. But it requires a broad range of people to be in those decision-making roles to make it an even space for people. And I think that's been missing for quite a long time, is that breadth of lots of different areas of diversity, age, experience, gender, to make things that little bit easier for the next group coming through.
Of course, we still see occasional bits of criticism on social media. Imagine if you put on a conducting workshop for males only.
Yeah.
You know, the counter-argument to that is very simple, isn't it?
It definitely is. Affirmative action is difficult and complex, and that's not to say that men do not face lots of challenges and barriers, because they do. So it's not about that at all, but it's about seeing the gaps that are there and opening up opportunities to rebalance. And we've had lots of conversations in the BB office in the last little while about the differences between equity and equality and what that means. And this is a prime example of that, really. Equality is giving everyone the same box to stand on when you've got a tall fence. Yeah, that is going to help some people, but it's not going to help everyone. But equity is about giving people the right size box so they all get an even viewpoint. And that's the difference. And that's the argument for positive action. And when you see that image, you go, oh, of course.
It's very powerful. It's good to know that there's good work going on now. And of course, BB is always very supportive of organisations like that.
Now I'm going to speak to Tracy Maguire. Tracy was the winner of one of Brass Bands England awards a few years ago, and that award was for her composition, A New Anthem. It's a piece that she wrote about Sarah Everard and all of the activity that happened in the wake of her death. Tracy was one of the co-founders of Femme Fortissimo, which is an all-female brass band based in York. So I know she's very, very passionate about this topic. Hi, Tracy. Lovely to have you here. Let's start with Femme Fortissimo. Tell us about them as an organisation.
So Femme Fortissimo, we're a group of women brass banders, and we're mainly based in York and around the Yorkshire area. The original idea came about in 2018 when Kate Locke gathered together a scratch band for the York International Women's Week, celebrating 100 years since some women in the UK got the vote. At the first concert, we played a very basic version of Ethel Smythe's The March of the Women, which had been written for the suffragette movement. And the 2018 event, it's been intended as a one-off scratch event, but there were so many of us there who enjoyed it, we just decided we wanted to do it again. And that's where I got involved in the organisational side, primarily coordinating players and sorting out online stuff. So that's where Femme Fortissimo started. It was never intended as an ongoing regular band. It was a one-off thing, but now it's become an annual event. It's just something that we enjoy doing. It's very supportive environment, and we have a broad mix of players from almost beginners to championship section players. So it's very interesting and enjoyable.
And you also have guest and sometimes regular female conductors as well, which is a really great thing
Yes,
to
we have
do.
had some guest players along. We had the likes of Rebecca Lundberg there. Siobhan Bates has played. Sue Sykes conducted our first 3 concerts. She conducts the York Concert Band. Claire Winter, who many people in brass banding will know through her conducting and playing, has conducted 2 of our concerts. It is a big time commitment for them. We don't expect conductors to do this regularly. And this year we're going to have Abby Ronggong, who formerly was conducting York University Brass Band and also was at our recent conducting workshop with Katrina Marcella. So we're very much looking forward to our next concert in 2025.
So you're with this amazing group. How did the inspiration for the piece come from that group?
Well, if I go back to what I said about the first event where we played Ethel Smythe's The March of the Women, which was originally dedicated to the suffragette movement. Now, I actually worked up a more involved arrangement of that, and we played it again at the 2019 concert. But I think it was sometime later in 2019 that myself and Kate spoke with you, if you remember, about the idea of maybe commissioning a new piece for a brass band or maybe holding a composition competition. I think that was towards the end of 2019, wasn't it?
It was pre-COVID because we met at Kate's house.
Yes, in York, yes. And we were starting to think about planning for the 2020 concert, but then lockdown happened. And so much stuff ended up being put on hold. So that was the start of the idea of doing something. Specifically, though, with regards to this piece, the impetus really came about because of the murder in March 2021 of Sarah Everard in London by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. Sarah's murder, the subsequent trial, the reactions to it provide a lot of understandable anger. Sarah grew up and went to Fulford School in York. Now, I don't know Sarah's family personally, but I do get involved in a lot of music activities around York and even know some of the teachers from our old school. And so some of this felt very close to home. In October 2021, I actually wrote a poem in response to this called Enough is Enough. And then it was during the following Christmas period, we're still under lockdown restrictions. I mean, those of us involved in music activities, it would have been one of our busiest times of the year, and there wasn't really a lot going on. And I was thinking of things to do. And it was then that I revisited that idea that we'd had of maybe having a new women's piece or anthem. And I thought about using my poem as the inspiration for that. And so I took some of the verses and I created 3 different themes, which then sort of helped me structure the piece. And basically, that's how it came about. I tend to call it a striding song rather than a march, because I can picture the suffragettes confidently striding along to it rather than all marching in step.
Yes, a protest piece.
Yes, I think so. But it does sort of have the structure and the feel of a march. So it's got that sort of slightly classical brass band feel to it. I was really pleased that we actually then performed it at our 2022 concert, which is our first concert back after lockdown. And also particularly pleased that some of the teachers and students from Fulford School were able to come along. And one of the students actually read out my poem at the concert, which is quite moving, I think.
Yeah, a really personal story and a really personal link to the piece. I'm really delighted that we are able to have it in the archive. Everything that happened around Sarah Everard feels like a very specific moment in time. For lots of women across the country, it was a very, very powerful, emotional time.
Absolutely. I mean, some of the reactions, there was some of the victim blaming and that women were responsible for their own safety. The fact that it was a serving police officer, and also some of the stuff that happened around the vigils following it as well. Yes, very memorable and painful.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the process of you submitting your piece and having it in the archive?
I think it's one of my music friends. I'm not sure how I was talking with someone about the archive and messaged me and said, hey, send them your new anthem. I think it should be in the archive. I said, really? Well, okay. And I ended up liaising, I think it was with Eleanor.
Yes, he was our old archivist, but still works at Heritage Key. So she's still linked in with the archive and very interested in what happens.
I think I might have met her when I came along at the conference last year and did a tour of the archive. Yes. And I contacted her and said, look, someone suggested you might be interested in having this piece in your archive. Said, yeah, absolutely. So, well, actually, I've got it all as PDFs. Wouldn't you just like the PDFs? And then there was this frenzied sort of, hang on a minute, I'm not sure what we're supposed to do with that. And that was where I think it came about that my piece then instigated you setting up your procedures for dealing with online material. So going forward in the future, you now can take these into the archive.
Yeah, the archive that was given to us, the initial collection that we worked through was predominantly physical. The main bulk of it is older music. And I think it's a good point. There's no line when it becomes history because we're preserving stuff for the future as well. And I think that's something that people probably assume that the only thing that we'd be interested in the archive is, you know, something from the 1800s. And we're definitely interested in all of that. And we still get lots of amazing new things that come through. But it's also about retaining what happened now for future years. So yeah, don't be scared if you're not fully published or you haven't got anything like that. If it's got interesting provenance and is unique in the way that a new anthem definitely is, it's still absolutely of interest. And like you say, it preserves a very specific point in time from an archival point of view. That's really interesting. And we often think about how it's going to be useful for research. So someone who might be researching the societal response to Sarah Everard, well, actually, that's a really unique piece that hopefully will be used in research too. So yeah, increasingly we are accepting digital acquisitions to the archive. But yeah, it was the first point that we had to get the policies together and make sure that we knew exactly what we were doing to take that on.
Well, glad I could help.
Exactly. You pushed us forward, Tracy, an innovator, always. In terms of Femmes Fortissimo then, and the work that you do, I know that York International Women's Week is kind of a feature of what you do. Do you feel like you have a role in telling female stories? Is that a big part of what the band does, do you think?
I think it can be. I mean, we had thought about other things that we might do, and we have sort of got involved in some of the things, some of the workshops, and obviously the conducting mentoring programme that yourselves and AMP ran last year. I mean, as it turned out, we have tended to focus on the annual concert. I mean, everyone loves being part of that.
Yeah.
The thing is, our players, many of them play regularly in lots of other bands, and there are sort of serious time commitments for them. So it is difficult for us to do too much. But yes, anything I think is practical, then maybe.
Yeah. It's one of the things that's really wonderful about the band. Virtually everyone who plays still also plays with their own band as well. It's just this additional place that women can gather and be together, which is an amazing thing.
Yes. I think that's certainly one of the things that many of the players who maybe have been a little less confident in their own bands come along and feel, you know, that the support and the experience has helped them going back to play it with their regular bands. I mean, it is a different environment, a different atmosphere, I think. Yes, we have moved on. There are more women represented across bands. It's a more balanced mix. Although, as you know, the conducting side, not so much, but it is improving. And certainly, I wouldn't want to be saying we should have regular women-only bands, not at all. But I think there is a place for this to happen to help support.
Yeah. So what do you and other players feel that's different about it? Just the environment that's created, do you think?
I'm old enough to remember a time when I was at school when there were very few women in brass bands, certainly at the top level. And I played with one or two at that time, and I didn't find them particularly welcoming. It's very much a different sort of a culture around them. I mean, there are differences when men and women gather together. I don't really want to get into that too much at this point.
Yeah.
You could go and talk forever and ever about what the problems are. But there are some things. I think certainly if women are in an all-women environment, I think perhaps maybe they feel a bit more confident about speaking up. There is some aspect of that to it, I believe.
Thank you so much for joining me, Tracy. It's been so interesting to hear about your piece and it being in the archive. I really, really hope that people use it and access it, because that's part of the reason, preserving it, but also to be there to use as well. So thank you so much for your time.
That was a piece called Beyond the Light by Liz Lane, played by the Grimethorpe Colliery Band. That was a piece that was actually performed at Brass and Concert last year. Of course, Brass and Concert's been an event that's featured quite a few different types of programmes, notably by people like Alan Worthington, that have projected the female image into the brass band spotlight a bit more.
Yeah, we have very deliberately chosen all female composers for the music for this episode. It wasn't that hard. There's lots of great music out there. But what some of those programmes at Brass in Concert do, and what that can be a really great vehicle for, is telling female stories. And I think that's the next step forward. It's one thing making sure you've got a balance, but it's showcasing women too. And it wasn't the most uplifting set, but the set that Carlton Main did a couple of years ago on Anne Frank was great. It was one of my favourites. It shows that there's so much potential there that bands can think about that with their programming. Bands like Fulham Band have been doing this for a long time. They make active choices about their programming. It's something their players are very passionate about. It's not just kind of a management decision. The younger your demographic gets of players in the band, the more they'll be asking that of you. And I think that's something to bear in mind. It's a very active conversation about representation, and they'll be expecting more.
It'd be nice to think, though, that we could get away from this kind of thought that some people will have, we're almost kind of doing people a favour by asking them, though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. For the youth champs, we do an open call for adjudicators, and we have for the last couple of years. It hasn't been difficult for us to select a balanced panel that are high quality.
Highly skilled panel.
It hasn't been that hard. So I think that attitude that is very, very prevalent of, oh, we'll pick the best person. Yeah, your intentions are probably very good with that, but the reality is the best person might not know their way in or know that's open to them. So sometimes opening that door a little bit makes a really big difference, and I'm excited to see more of that. And the more conversations that I have with members, I can see that happening. I can see people really wanting to do that work.
I mean, the whole world of professional music, certainly classical music, has faced similar challenges.
Yeah.
And we might just have been a few years further behind in terms of progress, and we're still catching up, I guess. But you don't have to be too far away from a newspaper to see regularly there's issues that are being raised because of the gender balance in professional music.
In professional music, but in all professional settings, there are still lots of barriers for women being in high profile positions. It's one of the things that I'm really proud of for BBE in the way that we work and the way that we support people. I don't think I'd be in the position that I'm in with an 18-month-old doing the work I do with many other organisations. But BBE made that work in a really amazing way for me personally.
Well, we have a very strong female representation of the staff generally.
Yeah, we do. We are, I think, about 83% female.
About 83.
My last calculation, about 83. And that's been pretty consistent, and something that we started quite a few years ago now was anonymous recruitment. And that's now in our standard practice. So we don't see any identifying features about people when they apply. Did that change our decisions about any people? I don't know. But it really makes you check your bias when you're having those conversations.
It has been a fascinating experience watching the staff grow from 6 years ago to what we have now. I've got 23 staff, and it's been an amazing evolution. Just watching the various different departments expand during that time.
So this is the final episode of this series. It's been great to sit and chat about lots of bandy things. I've really, really loved it. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the series too. We'll be back with a new series in the near future. Keep an eye out on our social media channels to see when that's announced. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about next. We're going to leave you with one final piece of audio for you, and this is a recording from our first Elevate performance, Kinky Toots, which was an amazing collaboration of brass bands, drag and queer culture. And just a little reminder from our director of that project, Jamie Fletcher, about the importance of diversity and representation.
Hi everybody, I'd say I'd just really love to see your faces, but these lights are pretty bright, I can't see anything. As a director, I don't often get the opportunity to say a few words before a show. I'm usually sort of hidden at the back, but I'll take this opportunity to say a few things, if I may. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, there were two things for me that undoubtedly shaped who I am today. One of those was, as a young person, playing in brass bands. That experience really was a wonderful thing to be part of. But the other thing was Section 28, a law that was passed that criminalised homosexuality and prevented the education and kind of celebration and welcoming of LGBT people. Now, you know, I grew up in Saddleworth, and you know, I have such fond memories of seeing the brass bands coming into the town for Whit Friday March contests and being there as a kid with my pea shooter to playfully target the rival bands. It was later that I then joined a band after fancying a young boy who was one of the cornet players. So I quickly wanted to be part of a band and fell in love with it. And later on, I moved from cornet to tenor horn when I realised a bit more about my gender identity and wanted to be part of the popular girls playing tenor horn. I guess you could say that I partly learnt about who I am from being part of being in a brass band. But Section 28 really did impact who I am. It forced me to stay in the closet, made me feel shame, and really impacted how I felt about myself. Section 28 came into force in 1988, and it wasn't repealed until 2003 in England, by which point I'd just left Leeds College of Music as an adult. I'm now nearly 40, and I stand here and I feel very proud as a queer trans woman and as a northerner. I love what I do as a director, but right now in 2024, our government is trying to turn back time, trying to pass laws and take away our rights, particularly for those of us who are trans, denying us our rights and access to healthcare. When I saw this opportunity with Brass Bands England to do something that could be celebratory of queer identities and brass bands, I jumped at the chance to pitch an idea that would celebrate brass bands, drag culture, queer cabaret, and, well, here we are tonight. We've got a real spectacle lined up for you this evening. You know, this collaboration with Brass Bands England, Freckleton Band, and with drag king Len Blanco and drag queen Donna Trump, it's, you know, this is an unforgettable evening, I think, and one that I hope you will not just sit and be polite and quiet, but one that you will roar with laughter, give lots of applause and cheers, and have a really wonderful night. So I guess without further ado, I'd really love to invite to the stage musical director Adam Taylor and the members of the Freckleton Band.
The Brass Band Podcast Archive Edition is brought to you by Brass Bands England. Thank you to Arts Council England, National Lottery Heritage Fund and the Scottish Power Foundation for their support. Thanks also to World of Brass for the beautiful music they provided. To listen to all of the music from this episode and so much more, head to whatplay.com.
To find out more about this series and the wider work of Brass Bands England, head over to our website at bbe.org.uk and follow us on social media. If you think you have a unique item that would be suitable for the archive, get in touch with us by emailing archive@bbe.org.uk.
If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review and make sure you're subscribed to avoid missing out on any of our upcoming episodes. Share your favourite moments on social media and use the hashtag BrassBandPodcast. Your support goes a really long way. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for our next episode.